The wind howled across the Montana plains as Jackson Miller stood alone on the train platform, pocket watch in hand, wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. The wealthy rancher had built an empire from nothing but dirt and determination. Yet here he was, fidgeting like a schoolboy as he awaited the arrival of a woman he'd never met. A mail-order bride whose photograph had shown a plain, unremarkable face. Plain was fine with Jackson. Plain meant practical. Plain meant she might actually stay, unlike the parade of frontier beauties who'd taken one look at the isolated Evergreen Ranch and found urgent business back east. What Jackson didn't expect was the woman who stepped off that train. Her eyes, the color of storm clouds about to break, carrying a medical bag instead of a suitcase, and the secret that would change everything at Evergreen Ranch forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer of 1894 had been unforgiving to the cattle ranchers of Montana Territory. 3 months without decent rain had turned the usually lush grasslands around Pine Creek into brittle yellow patches that cracked underfoot. Jackson Miller stood at the fence line of Evergreen Ranch, watching as his men drove the herd toward the northern pasture where the creek still offered enough water to keep the animals alive. At 42, Jackson's face was a weathered map of the life he'd carved out of this unforgiving land. Deep lines around eyes that had squinted into too many sunsets, a strong jaw permanently set against hardship. "We'll lose at least 30 head if this keeps up," said Curtis Norris, the ranch foreman who'd been by Jackson's side for 15 years. Curtis was a bow-legged man with a tobacco-stained mustache and hands so calloused they resembled leather. "Simmons already lost twice that over at Crescent Ridge." Jackson nodded, reaching down to grab a handful of parched soil, letting it sift through his fingers. "Send 10 men to dig out the spring in the east meadow. We might get enough flow to water the weaker calves." Curtis hesitated, shifting his weight from one boot to the other. "That'll take most of the hands we got left. The younger boys are already talking about heading to the mines up north. Better pay, they say. Double their wages until the drought breaks," Jackson said without hesitation. "We didn't survive the winter of '91 to lose everything to a dry spell." The truth was, Evergreen Ranch wasn't just surviving, it was thriving in a way that made other ranchers eye Jackson's land with something between envy and suspicion. While neighboring properties struggled with debt and declining herds, Jackson's operation had expanded to over 20,000 acres, with the finest breeding stock in 3 counties. The main house, Aspen Lodge, stood like a declaration of success against the backdrop of Eagle Ridge Mountains, its 2 stories of sturdy pine and river rock rising above the landscape like a monument to one man's tenacity. What few people in Pine Creek remembered was that Jackson Miller had arrived in town 20 years earlier with nothing but the clothes on his back and a letter informing him that his estranged Uncle Harold had left him a run-down cabin and 100 scraggly cattle. The locals had placed bets on how long the quiet, bookish Easterner would last in the unforgiving Montana wilderness. Jackson had heard the whispers, seen the smirks. He'd simply put his head down and worked, reading agricultural journals by lamplight, implementing new breeding methods, investing in water rights, while others wasted money on whiskey and cards. Now, the same men who dismissed him tipped their hats respectfully when he walked into the First National Bank of Pine Creek, where he held more notes than the banker himself. "Mr. Miller," Mrs. Viola Patterson called from the wide porch of Aspen Lodge as Jackson approached from the fields. The housekeeper had managed his household for the past decade, a stern widow with a knack for running the domestic side of Evergreen with military precision. "Mr. Tate from the bank delivered these papers for your signature, and Dr. Wilson stopped by to check on that stallion. Says he's healing nicely." Jackson nodded, taking the envelope she extended. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. Any other news from town? The housekeeper's lips thinned slightly. Martha Jennings was spreading stories at the general store again. Seems Miss Sullivan has accepted George Simmons' proposal. Something flickered across Jackson's face. Not quite pain, but perhaps a distant cousin to disappointment. Rebecca Sullivan had been Pine Creek's schoolteacher for 2 years, a lively young woman with auburn hair and a love of poetry. Jackson had found himself lingering in town on Saturdays when she might be at the general store, engaging her in conversations about books that somehow never progressed to anything more personal. Now she would be marrying Simmons, a man whose cattle regularly wandered onto neighboring properties and whose hands were known more for their quick tempers than their work ethic. "I'm sure they'll be very happy," Jackson said flatly, moving past Mrs. Patterson toward his study. "You shouldn't wait forever, Mr. Miller," the housekeeper called after him, her voice softening in a rare display of personal concern. "This house needs more than just one man rattling around in it." Jackson didn't respond. He entered his study, the one room in the house that truly felt like his, and closed the door behind him. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 2 walls, filled with volumes on cattle breeding, water management, and the leather-bound classics he'd collected since childhood. A massive oak desk dominated the space, its surface covered with ledgers and correspondence. Behind it, large windows offered views of the distant mountains, currently hazy with smoke from forest fires miles away. He sat heavily in his chair, staring at the latest letter from the cattle broker in Chicago. Beef prices were falling again. The railroad was raising shipping costs. News from the east suggested another financial panic might be looming. His gaze wandered to the bottom drawer of his desk, and after a moment's hesitation, he pulled it open. Inside lay a single worn magazine, Matrimonial News, folded open to a page filled with advertisements from women seeking husbands in the Western Territories. He'd purchased it on a whim during his last trip to Helena after overhearing 2 ranchers discussing the advantages of mail-order brides. "No fuss, no courtship," one had said, "just an arrangement that works for both parties." Jackson had never considered himself a lonely man. He had his books, his land, his accomplishments, but lately, the silence of Aspen Lodge seemed to press against him like a physical weight, especially in the evenings when the day's work was done. Mrs. Patterson left at sundown, returning to her small house near the stables. Curtis and the other hands retreated to the bunkhouse, and Jackson would sit alone in his study, listening to the grandfather clock tick away the hours, occasionally glancing at the empty chair across from his. The advertisement he kept returning to was modest compared to the others. Educated woman. Of 30, plain appearance but good health, seeks correspondence with gentlemen of means in Western Territories. No drinkers or gamblers. References available upon request. E.H., Boston, Massachusetts. No flowery language, no promises of beauty or domestic skills. Just a straightforward offer that matched his own practical nature. He'd written to the address listed 4 months ago. His letter equally direct. Owner of cattle ranch in Montana Territory. Stable financial position. Private quarters available in modern home. Seeking companionable wife. References from bank and local doctor. Enclosed, J. Miller, Pine Creek, Montana Territory. Their correspondence had been brief but revealing. E.H. Emma Hayes was an educated woman who had served as a governess and companion to a wealthy Boston family until their financial reversals left her without position. She made no pretenses about seeking romance or adventure, only a secure place and useful work. When Jackson had requested a photograph, she'd sent a small tintype showing a woman with unremarkable features, hair pulled severely back, and eyes that looked directly at the camera without artifice. Perfect, Jackson had thought. Not a delicate beauty who would wither in the harsh Montana climate or flee back east at the first winter storm. Not a young girl with romantic notions about frontier life, just a practical woman for a practical arrangement. 3 letters later, they had an agreement. Jackson would send train fare and meet her at the Pine Creek station on September 15th. If either party wished to terminate the arrangement upon meeting, Miss Hayes would be provided return fare to Boston. No questions asked. Jackson looked up. From the magazine, his attention caught by a knock at the study door. "Come in," he called, quickly shutting the drawer. Curtis entered, removing his hat. "Sorry to bother you, boss, but we've got trouble at the north pasture. Simmons' men are claiming our cattle broke through their fence line." Jackson sighed, standing and reaching for his hat. "His fence has more holes than Swiss cheese. Get the ledger with our brand records. We'll ride out now." As they walked toward the stables, Curtis cleared his throat. "Heard something else in town today. About that woman you've been writing to back east." Jackson stopped, turning to face his foreman. And what might that be? "Martha, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." A muscle tightened in Jackson's jaw. He'd hoped to handle the matter discreetly, to spare both himself and Miss Hayes the inevitable town gossip until after they'd had a chance to meet properly. "People will talk," Jackson said finally. "Let them. I've never cared much for Pine Creek's opinion." Curtis nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "It's not my place to say, boss. But are you sure about this? Bringing a stranger all the way from Boston? There are plenty of suitable women right here in the territory. Name one who'd consider marrying a man who spends 16 hours a day working and prefers reading to socializing." Jackson replied with a rare hint of humor. "Besides, Miss Hayes understands exactly what she's agreeing to. A simple arrangement between 2 practical people." "If you say so," Curtis muttered, though his tone suggested he remained unconvinced. "Just don't want to see you taken advantage of. These Eastern women hear about a successful rancher and get all sorts of ideas." Jackson let the comment pass without response. The truth was, doubts had begun to creep into his mind as the date of Miss Hayes' arrival approached. What if she found ranch life unbearable? What if the practical arrangement he'd proposed left them both trapped in uncomfortable silence? What if the plain, straightforward woman from the tin type had misrepresented herself entirely? As they saddled their horses, Jackson pushed these thoughts aside. He was a man who solved problems methodically, who planned for contingencies, who never acted on impulse or emotion. Whatever complications arose from Miss Hayes' arrival, he would handle them. With the same calm deliberation he applied to every aspect of his life. What Jackson couldn't possibly know was that Emma Hayes was at that very moment seated on an eastbound train less than a day's journey from Pine Creek, staring out the window at the unfamiliar landscape, a letter from Jackson Miller folded neatly in her pocket, and a secret that would upend everything he thought he knew about his carefully ordered future. The train lurched as it began the steep climb into mountain territory. In her second-class compartment, Emma Hayes steadied herself against the worn velvet seat, one hand automatically reaching to secure the small leather medical bag at her feet. The other passengers, a mother with 2 sleeping children and an elderly man with a silver-tipped cane, had long since stopped trying to engage her in conversation. She had responded politely but briefly to their inquiries, her Boston accent marking her as an outsider, her reserved demeanor discouraging further questions. Emma turned her attention back to the landscape unfolding beyond the soot-streaked window. Gone were the dense forests of the east, replaced by vast open spaces that both terrified and exhilarated her. The vastness seemed to mirror the emptiness she had carried within her since that terrible day at the Hartwell mansion. the day that had forced her to consider the unthinkable option of becoming a mail-order bride. She reached into her modest carpet bag, fingers finding the folded tintype she had sent to Jackson Miller. It was not, strictly speaking, a dishonest image. The woman in the photograph was indeed Emma Hayes, but Emma Hayes as she had appeared. 2 years earlier, during the darkest period of her life, when grief and exhaustion had stripped her face of youth and vitality. The severe hairstyle, the plain high-neck dress, the expression devoid of warmth, all relics of a time when she had believed her life's purpose was destroyed forever. The Emma Hayes who now traveled west bore only a passing resemblance to that image. While still not conventionally beautiful, regular meals and rest had softened her features. Her brown hair, freed from its severe style, now framed her face in gentle waves. Most transformed were her eyes, no longer dull with despair, but alert, intelligent, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had faced their worst fears and survived. She had not intentionally misled Mr. Miller. When his first letter arrived, she had simply sent the only photograph she possessed of herself. By the time she realized the discrepancy between her current appearance and the image he'd received, their agreement was already in place. To send a new photograph might have suggested vanity or deception, neither quality appropriate for the business-like arrangement they had established. More troubling was the matter of her medical bag and the skills it represented. Emma had assisted the family physician throughout her tenure with the Hartwells, developing knowledge far beyond what most companions possessed. When young Thomas Hartwell contracted scarlet fever, it was Emma who had maintained the cold compresses, administered the medicines, monitored his breathing through endless nights while the doctor made his rounds elsewhere. When Mrs. Hartwell suffered from female complaints, it was Emma who discreetly prepared the necessary treatments and provided comfort. She had not, however, mentioned these skills in her correspondence with Mr. Miller. Such knowledge in a woman often bred suspicion rather than appreciation, particularly in remote communities where formal medicine struggled against folk remedies and superstition. Better to present herself as a former governess with basic educational abilities, a role that would be welcomed in a frontier settlement without raising uncomfortable questions about her past. The train whistle shrieked, pulling Emma from her thoughts. A conductor moved through the car announcing, "Helena Station, 10 minutes, Helena Station." Emma gathered her belongings, preparing for the transfer to the local line that would carry her the final distance to Pine Creek. In her pocket, she felt the crinkle of Jackson Miller's last letter. Practical, straightforward, devoid of sentimentality. Exactly what she had hoped for. A business arrangement, she whispered to herself as the train began to slow. Nothing more. But as the platform came into view, crowded with people waiting to board, Emma felt an unexpected flutter of nervousness. Tomorrow she would meet the man who had agreed to make her his wife, sight unseen. Tomorrow she would begin a new life in a place where no one knew her name or her past. Tomorrow, for better or worse, Emma Hayes would step off a train in Pine Creek, Montana territory, and into a future she could not possibly predict. What she could not know was that fate had already set in motion events that would shatter the careful arrangement she and Jackson Miller had constructed through their practical letters. For even as Emma prepared to disembark in Helena, Jackson stood in his study at Evergreen Ranch, unfolding a telegram that had just arrived from Boston, a message that would cause him to look at the approaching train the next day with dread rather than anticipation. The telegram sat on Jackson's desk like a coiled rattlesnake, its yellow paper innocuous but threatening. He'd read it a dozen times since its delivery, each reading making the words no less disturbing. Regarding Miss Hayes, stop serious concerns. About character. Stop dismissed from Hartwell household under questionable circumstances. Stop rumored involvement with death of child in her care. Stop verify credentials before proceeding. Stop James Whitcomb, ESQ Boston. Jackson ran a hand through his hair, staring out the window at the fading daylight. The telegram had been sent by a lawyer he'd never heard of, responding to his routine inquiries about Emma Hayes's references. He'd expected a simple confirmation, perhaps a polite endorsement of her character. Instead, this cryptic warning had arrived just hours before the woman herself was due in Pine Creek. "Mr. Miller?" Mrs. Patterson's voice accompanied a knock. At the study door. "Reverend Collins is here to see you." Jackson quickly folded the telegram and slipped it into his desk drawer. "Send him in." Reverend Peter Collins was a circuit preacher who visited Pine Creek every few weeks, holding services in the small white church at the edge of town. A man of medium height with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had witnessed both the best and worst of human nature. "Jackson," he said warmly, extending his hand, "Mrs. Patterson mentioned your expected arrival tomorrow. I thought I should pay a visit." Jackson gestured to the chair across from his desk. Word travels fast. "In Pine Creek? Faster than the telegraph." The Reverend smiled, taking a seat. "Martha Jennings has been telling anyone who'll listen that you've ordered yourself a bride from back east. I thought you might appreciate hearing the news from a friendly source." "I didn't order anyone," Jackson said more sharply than he'd intended. "Miss Hayes and I have a mutual understanding, a practical arrangement." "Of course," Reverend Collins nodded. "I've performed many such marriages for settlers in these parts. Sometimes the deepest bonds form from practical beginnings." Jackson reached for the decanter on his desk, pouring 2 small glasses of whiskey. "You didn't ride all this way to offer marriage advice." "No," the Reverend admitted, accepting the offered glass. "I came because I've known you for 15 years, and in all that time, I've never seen you act hastily or without thorough consideration. This arrangement seems uncharacteristic." The accusation hung in the air between them. Jackson took a slow sip of whiskey, considering his response. He respected Collins enough to give, "I know enough." The Reverend studied him over the rim of his glass. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned Miss Hayes arrives on tomorrow's afternoon train. I could be available afterward, should you wish to proceed immediately with the ceremony." The telegram in the desk drawer seemed to pulse like a guilty heartbeat. Jackson set his glass down with deliberate care. "I'll make that decision after meeting the lady in person," he said. "Our agreement includes the option for either party to withdraw." "A sensible provision," Collins nodded. "And if you do proceed, would you prefer the service here or in town?" "Here," Jackson said without hesitation. He had no desire to subject himself or Miss Hayes to the prying eyes of Pine Creek's residents. Small, private, just the necessary witnesses. The Reverend finished his whiskey and rose. "I'll be ready when you are, and Jackson, whatever happens tomorrow, remember that marriages, even practical ones, require faith. Faith in the other person, faith in yourself, and faith that together you might build something greater than either could alone." After the Reverend departed, Jackson returned to the window, watching as twilight settled over Evergreen Ranch. Workers were returning from the fields, dust rising from the hooves of horses being led to the stables. The evening routine unfolded with familiar precision. Men heading to the cookhouse for supper, lamps being lit in the bunkhouse, Curtis making his final rounds to check the stock. It was a world Jackson had built through meticulous planning and careful decision-making. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing proceeded without his approval. Yet tomorrow, a woman he knew only through a handful of letters would step off the train, potentially bringing chaos into his ordered existence. He withdrew the telegram again, studying the disturbing message. questionable circumstances. Death of a child. These were serious allegations, yet frustratingly vague. There could be perfectly innocent explanations. People gossiped, misunderstandings happened, and James Whitcomb, Esquire, could be a competitor for Miss Hayes's affections, or someone with a personal grudge. Jackson prided himself on fairness. He would not condemn Emma Hayes based on a single telegram. He would meet her, speak with her, look into her eyes, and determine for himself what truth or falsehood lived there. If necessary, he would send further inquiries to Boston, speak to other references. The practical arrangement they had negotiated included time to assess compatibility. He would simply use that time to investigate these allegations discreetly. With this decision made, Jackson felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. He had a plan, and plans had always been his comfort. Whatever surprise awaited him at the train station tomorrow, he would face it with the same methodical approach that had served him throughout his life. As he prepared for bed that night, Jackson found himself standing before the small mirror in his bedroom, critically assessing his appearance. His face was tanned and weathered from years working outdoors, lines etched deeply around his eyes and mouth. His dark hair showed streaks of gray at the temples, and his mustache needed trimming. Not a young man anymore, certainly not the dashing figure that might impress an Eastern lady, regardless of how practical her expectations might be. For a moment, he considered what Emma Hayes might see when she stepped off that train tomorrow. A successful rancher, yes, but also a man whose entire life had been shaped around work and duty. A man who lived in a fine house filled with books he rarely had time to read. A man who knew more about cattle breeding than polite conversation. It doesn't matter, he told his reflection firmly. This isn't about attraction or affection. It's about compatible needs and mutual respect. But as he extinguished the lamp and lay in the darkness, Jackson Miller found sleep elusive. For the first time in years, his mind was not occupied with cattle prices or water rights or breeding lines. Instead, he found himself wondering about a woman from Boston with plain features and direct correspondence, traveling halfway across the country to meet a stranger she had agreed to marry. The morning of September 15th dawned clear and unusually cool. Jackson rose before the sun, as was his habit, and immediately set about his regular duties. He inspected the newest calves in the south pasture, discussed breeding records with Curtis, and reviewed the month's expenses with his bookkeeper. If he worked with greater intensity than usual, no one dared mention it. At noon, Mrs. Patterson appeared at the door of his study. "I've prepared the blue room for Miss Hayes," she said, her tone carefully neutral, "and pressed your good suit for the trip to town." Jackson nodded, not looking up from his ledger. "Thank you. The train arrives at 2 o'clock, she continued, when he offered nothing more. "Will you be wanting the carriage prepared?" "Yes, have David ready at around 1. He finally met her gaze. "I'll be going alone." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly. "As you wish. Though it might appear more welcoming if—" "I said I'll go alone," Jackson repeated more firmly this time. "If Miss Hayes decides to proceed with our arrangement, there will be plenty of time for introductions." The housekeeper pressed her, lips together, but nodded. "Of course. Will there be anything else?" "No, that will be all." After she left, Jackson opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a small velvet box. Inside lay a simple gold band, his mother's wedding ring, the only item he had kept after selling the rest of her modest jewelry to fund his early investments in Evergreen Ranch. He had never imagined giving it to anyone, had almost forgotten its existence until last night, when the thought had suddenly occurred to him that, should things proceed with Miss Hayes, he would need a ring for the ceremony. The ring represented a heritage of practical, hard-working people who valued substance over sentiment. He thought Emma Hayes might appreciate that, based on her letters. If they proceeded with the marriage, he would explain its significance. If not, well, the ring would return to its drawer, and life at Evergreen would continue as before. At precisely 1 o'clock, Jackson changed into his best suit, charcoal grey wool, seldom worn but well maintained. He examined himself critically in the mirror, stroking his freshly trimmed moustache and straightening his collar. Satisfied that he presented a respectable appearance, he placed the ring box in his pocket and headed downstairs. The carriage waited in the yard. David, a young stable hand, standing at attention beside the matched bay horses. Jackson noted with approval that the vehicle had been freshly washed, the brass fittings polished to a high shine. He was about to climb aboard when Curtis approached, expression troubled. "Boss, there's something you should know before you head to town." Jackson paused, 1 foot on the carriage step. "What is it?" "Riders came through this morning, passing word about a telegram that came into Helena yesterday." Curtis shifted, uncomfortably. "About about Miss Hayes." A cold feeling settled in Jackson's stomach. "What about her?" "Just rumors," Curtis said quickly. "Probably nothing to it. But there's talk that she was involved in some kind of scandal back east. Something about a child dying under her care." So, the information in his private telegram had somehow leaked. Jackson's expression hardened. "Who's spreading these rumors?" "I can't say for certain. Martha Jennings is telling everyone, but she claims she heard it from the stagecoach driver who brought the mail yesterday." Jackson absorbed this information silently. Pine Creek thrived on gossip. There was little entertainment otherwise. But this particular story, circulating on the very day of Emma Hayes' arrival, seemed deliberately timed to cause maximum embarrassment. "I'm aware of the rumors," he said finally. "They're unsubstantiated. I intend to discuss the matter directly with Miss Hayes." Curtis nodded, though uncertainty lingered in his eyes. "Just thought you should know what's being said. Town's likely to be busy today. People curious about, well, you know how they are." "I do," Jackson said grimly, "which is why I'll be bringing Miss Hayes directly back to Evergreen without parading her through town for their entertainment." "Might be for the best," Curtis agreed. "Good luck, boss." As the carriage rolled down the long drive toward Pine Creek, Jackson's mind returned to the telegram. He had hoped to approach the matter delicately after Miss Hayes had a chance to rest from her journey. Now it seemed the entire town would be watching their meeting, eager for any sign of scandal or disappointment. The road to town followed Silver Creek for several miles before turning east toward the settlement that had sprung up around the railroad 20 years earlier. Pine Creek wasn't large, perhaps 500 souls in total, but it served as a hub for the surrounding ranches and farms. The main street boasted the essentials: general store, bank, hotel, saloon, church, schoolhouse, and a handful of other businesses catering to local needs. As the carriage approached the outskirts, Jackson noticed immediately that Curtis had been right about one thing. The town was unusually busy for a Wednesday afternoon. Groups of people lingered outside the shops, ostensibly engaged in conversation, but clearly watching for his arrival. When the carriage passed, their chatter dimmed momentarily. The station master, a thin man with perpetually ink-stained fingers, greeted him with exaggerated cheerfulness. "Afternoon, Mr. Miller. Beautiful day for a journey, isn't it? Train's running right on time for once. Should be here in about 15 minutes. Jackson nodded curtly, moving to the far end of the platform where he could observe the approaching track without having to engage in further conversation. His posture was rigid, his expression deliberately neutral, as he felt the curious stares of townsfolk who had suddenly discovered urgent business at the station. Among them, he noticed Martha Jennings, the plump, perpetually flushed owner of the general store, accompanied by 2 younger women who kept glancing in his direction and whispering behind their hands. Nearby stood Frederick Tate from the bank, ostensibly reviewing papers, but positioned for an optimal view of the proceedings. Even Dr. Wilson had appeared, leaning against a post with arms crossed, his weathered face impassive but eyes alert. Jackson checked his pocket watch. 5 minutes until the train's scheduled arrival. He felt oddly exposed standing there, the focus of so much covert attention. This was precisely why he preferred the solitude of Evergreen Ranch. No prying eyes, no whispered judgments, no need to explain his decisions to anyone. The distant whistle of the approaching train cut through his thoughts. Down the track, a plume of smoke appeared above the trees, growing larger as the engine drew near. The waiting crowd stirred with anticipation, conversations hushing as the massive steam locomotive chugged into the station, brakes squealing, great clouds of steam billowing across the platform. Jackson remained where he was, watching as passengers began to disembark from the 3 passenger cars. Most were men, drummers with sample cases, laborers seeking work, a few well-dressed businessmen. The few women were either obviously local, returning from visits elsewhere, or clearly married to the men accompanying them. Then, from the second car, a woman appeared alone. She paused at the top of the steps, scanning the platform with a composed, searching gaze. She wore a plain navy traveling dress with a matching jacket, her brown hair arranged simply beneath a modest hat. In one gloved hand, she carried a small carpet bag. In the other, a curious leather case that resembled a doctor's bag. Jackson felt a jolt of recognition and confusion. This was Emma Hayes. He could see the basic structure of the face from the photograph, but the woman before him bore only a passing resemblance to the stern, almost haggard woman in the tintype she had sent. This Emma Hayes stood straight and confident, her features animated and far more appealing than he had expected. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was an intelligence in her clear grey eyes and a quiet dignity in her bearing that commanded attention. For a moment, Jackson remained frozen, reconciling the woman from the photograph with the one now descending to the platform. Then, aware of the watching crowd, he moved forward to meet her, removing his hat as he approached. "Miss Hayes?" he inquired, though he already knew the answer. She turned toward his voice, her expression composed but alert. "Mr. Miller, I presume?" "Yes. Welcome to Pine Creek." He offered a slight bow. "I trust your journey was not too arduous?" "It was. Long but uneventful, thank you." Her voice carried the refined accent of Boston, but there was a warmth to it that her letters had not conveyed. Her gaze was direct, assessing him just as carefully as he was assessing her. Jackson became acutely aware of the spectators edging closer, straining to overhear their exchange. Martha Jennings had maneuvered to within a few feet, pretending to adjust her hat while watching avidly. "My carriage is waiting," he said, gesturing toward where David stood with the vehicle. "May I?" He reached for her carpet bag, but she hesitated, glancing around at the gathered onlookers. "Is there somewhere we might speak privately first, Mr. Miller? I believe there are matters we should discuss before proceeding to your home." The request surprised him, though it shouldn't have. If Emma Hayes had heard even a whisper of the rumors circulating about her, she would naturally want to address them directly. "Of course," he said, lowering his voice. "The hotel has a private parlor we could use." She nodded, seemingly relieved. "That would be most appreciated." As they walked toward the Frontier Hotel, Jackson was intensely conscious of Emma beside him, her measured steps matching his, the light scent of lavender that surrounded her, the way she held herself with quiet confidence despite the curious stares following their progress. She was nothing like the plain, beaten-down woman he had expected from her photograph, and he found himself both intrigued and unsettled by the discrepancy. The Frontier Hotel was Pine Creek's only accommodation for travelers, a 2-story structure with pretensions of grandeur in its columned entrance and ornate lobby. The proprietor, a jovial man named Henson, greeted Jackson with exaggerated delight. Mr. Miller, what a pleasure to see you in town. And this must be... We require the use of your private parlor, Jackson interrupted, for an hour, perhaps two. Of course, Henson said, his eyes darting curiously between them. Right this way. May I send up tea? Coffee? Tea would be lovely, Emma said before Jackson could decline. Thank you. The parlor was a small but tastefully furnished room on the ground floor, offering more comfort than elegance with its worn velvet settee and sturdy oak tables. A window overlooked the hotel's modest garden, providing both light and a measure of privacy from the street. Once they were alone, with the door firmly closed, Emma turned to face Jackson directly. Mr. Miller, I believe we should speak frankly with one another. I agree, he said, gesturing for her to take a seat while remaining standing himself. There seem to be discrepancies that require explanation. A faint smile touched her lips. Indeed. Perhaps I should begin by addressing the most obvious one. She removed her gloves deliberately, then reached up to unpin her hat. With these barriers removed, the difference between the woman before him and the one in the photograph became even more pronounced. The severe lines were gone from her face, replaced by a gentle alertness that transformed her entirely. The photograph I sent you was taken during a difficult period in my life, she said simply. It was the only one I possessed when we began our correspondence. By the time I realized how much my appearance had recovered, our arrangements were already in place. I feared sending a new image might seem like misrepresentation or vanity. Jackson studied her face, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet strength in her expression. Not beautiful, no, but far from the plain, forgettable woman he had anticipated. I see, he said finally, and your medical bag. You made no mention of medical training in your letters. Emma's eyes widened slightly at his observation of the leather case she had carried from the train. You have a keen eye, Mr. Miller. Yes, this is a medical kit. During my time with the Hartwell family, I assisted their physician extensively. I developed some skills that have proven useful, though I have no formal qualifications. Is that what led to your dismissal from the Hartwell household? Jackson asked directly. Practicing medicine without qualification? The color drained from Emma's face. You've heard rumors. More than rumors. I received a telegram yesterday from Boston. It mentioned questionable circumstances and the death of a child in your care. Emma's hands tightened in her lap, knuckles whitening, but her gaze remained steady. I see. Then you know why I wish to speak privately before proceeding further. May I ask who sent this telegram? A lawyer named James Whitcomb. A small, bitter smile crossed her face. Ah, that explains much. Mr. Whitcomb was Mrs. Hartwell's brother. He never approved of my position in the household, particularly my medical responsibilities. And the child, Jackson pressed, watching her closely for any sign of deception. Emma's composure faltered for the first time. Something like grief flickered in her eyes before she regained control. Thomas Hartwell, age 7, he contracted scarlet fever during an outbreak that claimed 12 children in Boston last year. I cared for him day and night under Dr. Schmidt's direction, but the fever was particularly virulent. She took a deep breath before continuing. When Thomas died, Mrs. Hartwell was inconsolable. She needed someone to blame, and Mr. Whitcomb suggested that my care had been negligent. There was no truth to it. Dr. Schmidt himself defended my actions. But grief is not rational. The family needed me gone, and I understood their need. Jackson listened carefully, noting the pain behind her measured words. And you have references to support this account? Beyond Dr. Schmidt? I do. In my trunk, which should arrive on Friday's freight train, I have letters from Dr. Schmidt and from the Petersons, another family I served briefly after leaving the Hartwells. Both will attest to my character and capabilities. A soft knock At the door interrupted them. A hotel maid entered with the tea service, setting it on the table between them, before departing with a curious glance at Emma. Once they were alone again, Emma leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Miller, I understand if these revelations change your assessment of our arrangement." The practical, unremarkable bride he had anticipated had been replaced by someone with a complicated past and skills he hadn't known to consider. Yet there was something in her direct gaze, in the dignified way she faced these difficult questions, that resonated with his own pragmatic nature. "The townspeople know," he said finally. "Not the details, but enough to spread rumors. Your arrival has been anticipated." Emma's expression didn't change, but he noticed her shoulders straighten, almost imperceptibly. "I am accustomed to facing judgment, Mr. Miller. If you decide to proceed with our arrangement, you should know that I will not hide from gossip or false accusations. However, I would understand completely if you prefer not to associate yourself with such controversy." For a moment, Jackson was silent, weighing alternatives. The practical course would be to escort Miss Hayes back to the train station, provide return fare as agreed, and let her disappear from his life. Pine Creek would gossip briefly before finding new entertainment, and Evergreen Ranch would continue as before. Yet something about that solution felt wrong, not just because of the dignity with which Emma Hayes had explained her circumstances, but because Jackson Miller had spent his entire life proving others wrong. When they said he couldn't turn a failing ranch into a prosperous enterprise, he had done exactly that. When they claimed he lacked the knowledge to implement modern breeding methods, he had studied until he surpassed them all. The telegram from James Whitcomb now seemed less like a warning and more like an attempt to control a woman who had refused to be a convenient scapegoat. Jackson recognized in Emma Hayes something he valued in himself: the determination to stand firm against unfair judgment. "The arrangement we discussed in our correspondence was practical, not romantic," he said finally, meeting her gaze directly. "It outlined mutual responsibilities and benefits. Nothing in what you've shared today alters those fundamentals, unless you believe your medical skills would prevent you from fulfilling the role we discussed." Precisely at 5 o'clock, Reverend Collins arrived at Evergreen Ranch in his modest buggy. Jackson greeted him on the porch, freshly shaved and dressed in a crisp white shirt, dark suit and string tie, attire he normally reserved for business trips to Helena or Billings. "You look uncommonly formal," the Reverend observed with a smile. "Having second thoughts?" "No," Jackson replied firmly, "just respecting the occasion." Inside, the main parlor had been arranged for the ceremony. A simple arrangement of wildflowers gathered from the meadow sat on the mantel. The furniture had been rearranged to create a small area before the fireplace where the ceremony would take place. Mrs. Patterson had added touches that Jackson would never have considered. Clean white candles in polished silver holders, a new rug laid across the wooden floor. Curtis Norris and Dr. Wilson waited as witnesses, both men uncomfortable in their Sunday best. Dr. Wilson approached Jackson, speaking in a low voice. "I've heard the rumors about your bride, Jackson. As your physician and friend, I feel obligated to ask if you're certain about this course of action." Jackson regarded the older man steadily. "I've spoken with Miss Hayes directly. I'm satisfied with her explanations." "And her appearance? Martha Jennings is telling everyone she looks nothing like what was expected." "Martha Jennings would be wise to mind her own affairs," Jackson said flatly. "Miss Hayes explained the discrepancy. The photograph was taken during a difficult time." Dr. Wilson studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. You've always been a good judge of character. I trust your assessment." A hush fell over the room as Emma entered, accompanied by Mrs. Patterson. She wore the same navy traveling dress from earlier, now refreshed and paired with a simple lace collar. Her hair was arranged in a becoming style, soft waves framing her face. She carried no flowers, wore no veil, practical choices that somehow seemed right for the occasion. Jackson found himself struck again by how different she was from what he had expected. Not just her appearance, but her entire bearing. The Emma Hayes from her letters had seemed reserved to the point of coldness. The woman who now approached him met his gaze with quiet confidence and clear-eyed intelligence. They positioned themselves before Reverend Collins, facing each other as the minister opened his Bible. The ceremony was brief and unadorned, focusing on practical vows rather than romantic sentiments, to respect, to support, to work together in building a shared life. When the time came for the ring, Jackson withdrew his mother's simple gold band from his pocket. "This was my mother's," he explained quietly as he slipped it onto Emma's finger. She was a practical woman who valued hard work and honesty above all else. Emma looked at the ring, then back at him with unexpected warmth in her eyes. "I'm honored to wear it. By the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Collins concluded. "You may seal your vows with a kiss." A moment of awkwardness hung between them. Neither had considered this traditional conclusion to the ceremony. After a brief hesitation, Jackson leaned forward and placed a chaste kiss on Emma's cheek, a compromise between propriety and the reality of their arrangement. The small gathering offered subdued congratulations. There was no celebration, no wedding feast, only a simple dinner planned for later that evening. This suited both Jackson and Emma, who had no desire to turn their practical arrangement into a spectacle. As the witnesses departed and Reverend Collins prepared to leave, the clergyman took Jackson aside for a final word. "Marriage is more than a contract, Jackson, even one begun as practically as yours. Give it room to grow into something meaningful." Jackson nodded politely but made no response. The Reverend's romantic notions had no place in the arrangement. He and Emma had established. Once they were alone in the parlor, an awkward silence fell between the newly married couple. They were strangers bound by vows, now facing the reality of their hasty decision. "I've asked Mrs. Patterson to serve dinner in an hour," Jackson finally said. "Perhaps you'd like to rest before then, or I could show you around the house." "A tour would be welcome," Emma replied. "I should begin familiarizing myself with my new home." Jackson led her through Aspen Lodge methodically, explaining each room's function with the same clarity he might use to describe ranch operations. The ground floor contained the parlor, dining room, kitchen, and his study, a room he described as private but not forbidden. The second floor held their separate bedrooms, a library, and several unused guest rooms. The practical arrangement extended to their sleeping quarters. There had never been any expectation of sharing a room. As they entered the library, Emma's expression brightened visibly. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held hundreds of volumes, many showing signs of regular use. A large desk positioned near the windows offered views of the mountains while providing excellent light for reading. "You have an impressive collection," she observed, running her fingers lightly along the spines of several medical texts. "Many of these would be found in a physician's library. I believe in understanding all aspects of ranch operations," Jackson explained, "including animal health and basic human medicine. Dr. Wilson visits only once a month unless there's an emergency." Emma nodded, continuing to examine the books with genuine interest. "May I use this room?" "Of course. The entire house is accessible to you, with the exception of my study when I'm working." She turned to face him directly. "Perhaps now would be an appropriate time to discuss expectations. Our letters established the basics, but daily details matter in a functional household." Jackson appreciated her directness. "Agreed. Mrs. Patterson manages the domestic staff, currently 2 maids and a cook, as well as David, who handles the stable and drives the carriage. You'll have authority over household matters, but I suggest consulting Mrs. Patterson before making significant changes. She's served Evergreen well for many years. A sensible arrangement, Emma agreed. And my other responsibilities? You mentioned in your letters that the previous school teacher left Pine Creek last spring. Yes, the town has been without a teacher for several months. Given your background, I thought you might consider taking the position, though it's not a requirement of our arrangement. I would be glad to serve as teacher, Emma said. Education has always been my passion, even when my duties included other responsibilities. Good. The school term would begin in 2 weeks. I'll speak to the town council about your appointment. Jackson paused, considering his next words carefully. Regarding your medical knowledge, it could prove valuable here, where proper doctors are scarce. However, I suggest discretion initially. Pine Creek can be suspicious of unconventional practices. Emma's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. I understand. I have no intention of presenting myself as a physician. However, I won't pretend ignorance if my skills could benefit someone in need. Fair enough, Jackson nodded. Is there anything else you wish to clarify about our arrangement? Emma hesitated, then spoke carefully. Just one matter. In our correspondence, we address the practical nature of our marriage. I want to confirm that we share the same understanding regarding our agreement was for companionship and partnership in building Evergreen Ranch. I have no expectations beyond that. Thank you for the clarity, Emma said, her voice steady, though a faint color touched her cheeks. I believe clear understanding prevents future disappointments. Exactly so, Jackson agreed, relieved the awkward subject had been addressed directly. Shall we continue to the dining room? Dinner should be ready soon. Their first meal as husband and wife was a quiet affair. Mrs. Patterson had prepared a special menu: roast beef, fresh vegetables from the kitchen garden, apple pie for dessert, but otherwise made no fuss about the occasion. The three of them dined together, conversation limited to practical matters about the house and ranch. After dinner, Jackson excused himself to complete the day's correspondence in his study. Emma retired to her room, ostensibly to rest after her journey, but actually to begin a letter to Dr. Schmidt in Boston. She needed to inform him of her marriage and new address, should his testimonial be required to counter any further rumors from James Whitcomb. As she wrote by lamplight, Emma reflected on the day's events. She had arrived in Pine Creek prepared for rejection once Jackson Miller saw her changed appearance and learned of the rumors about her past. Instead, he had shown unexpected fairness, listening to her explanation and proceeding with their arrangement. Despite potential scandal, the man himself remained something of a mystery, reserved but not cold, practical but not harsh. He had built an impressive operation through methodical work rather than flamboyant risk-taking. His treatment of staff seemed fair, his home comfortable without being ostentatious. There were worse men to be bound to in a practical marriage. Still, as she prepared for her first night at Evergreen Ranch, Emma couldn't help wondering what lay beneath Jackson Miller's composed exterior. What dreams or disappointments had shaped him? What had driven him to seek a mail-order bride when he could surely have courted someone locally had he made the effort? These questions would have to wait. For now, Emma was simply grateful to have secured her position and escaped Boston's painful memories. Tomorrow would begin her new life as Mrs. Miller of Evergreen Ranch, a role she intended to fulfill with the same competence and dignity she had brought to every challenge in her life. The following morning established what would become their routine. Jackson rose before dawn, as was his habit, to begin ranch operations. Emma joined Mrs. Patterson in the kitchen an hour later, learning the household schedule and inventorying supplies. They ate breakfast separately, Jackson with Curtis and the ranch foreman in the cookhouse, Emma in the dining room with Mrs. Patterson. Mr. Miller prefers to discuss business during breakfast, the housekeeper explained. He'll join you for dinner each evening unless urgent matters arise. Emma nodded, accepting the arrangement as part of their practical marriage. I'd like to review the household accounts today, if you wouldn't object. Not to interfere, but to understand the operation. Mrs. Patterson seemed surprised, but not displeased. Of course. The previous Mrs. Miller, Mr. Miller's mother, that is, always managed the household accounts herself. I've maintained her system since her passing. You knew Mr. Miller's mother? Briefly. I came to Evergreen during her final illness, about 12 years ago. A remarkable woman, built the original homestead with her husband while raising Jackson alone after his father's death. He was just 9 when Mr. Miller Sr. was killed in a fall from a horse. Emma absorbed this information with interest. Jackson had mentioned his mother's ring, but offered no other details about his family. And after his mother died, Jackson was already running the ranch by then? Oh yes, he had been managing operations since he was 16 or so. Mrs. Miller suffered from consumption for many years before it finally took her. By the time I arrived, he had already expanded the property considerably from what his uncle left him. This glimpse into Jackson's past helped Emma understand him better. Responsibility had come early to him, as it had to her. Perhaps that explained his serious nature and preference for practical arrangements over emotional entanglements. After reviewing the household accounts, which were, as expected, meticulously organized, Emma asked to be shown the kitchen garden and poultry yard. These had been neglected somewhat since the cook, Mrs. Hollister, had arthritis that made bending difficult. I'd be happy to take charge of the garden, Emma offered. I find working with plants restful, and fresh vegetables would be a welcome addition to our table. Mrs. Patterson seemed pleased by this initiative. Mr. Miller appreciates good food, though he rarely comments on it. Mrs. Hollister will be grateful for the help. By mid-morning, Emma had established her role in the household enough to feel comfortable suggesting a ride to town. I should introduce myself properly to Pine Creek, and I'd like to see the schoolhouse if I'm to begin teaching soon. Mrs. Patterson sent David to prepare the carriage. As Emma waited on the porch, Jackson rode in from the east pasture, accompanied by Curtis and 2 other ranch hands. Seeing the carriage being readied, he changed direction and approached the house. "Are you going somewhere?" he asked, dismounting. "To town, if you have no objection," Emma replied. "I thought I should familiarize myself with Pine Creek, particularly the school." Jackson nodded, seeming to approve of her initiative. "A good idea. Pine Creek will be curious about you. Better to satisfy their interest directly than let rumors flourish." He hesitated, then added, "Would you like me to accompany you?" The offer surprised Emma. "I wouldn't want to take you from your work. I need to speak with Frederick Tate at the bank anyway," he said. "Give me 10 minutes to clean up and I'll join you." As they drove toward town, Emma was acutely aware of the curious glances from workers in the fields. News of their marriage had undoubtedly spread throughout Evergreen Ranch, adding another layer of interest to the already gossip-worthy arrival of the mail-order bride. "The south pasture needs irrigation work," Jackson commented, seemingly oblivious to her self-consciousness. "We've had 2 dry years in a row. I'm considering damming the upper creek to create a reservoir." Emma appreciated his treatment of her as a partner rather than a decorative addition to his household. "Would that affect your neighbor's water access?" "Simmons." Jackson's mouth tightened. "It's my water rights, established when I purchased the Upper Canyon 5 years ago." "I see, though I imagine water access creates tensions in dry years." Jackson glanced at her with new interest. "It does. Simmons believes I should share the creek equally, despite his refusal to contribute to the dam construction costs." "And what do you believe is fair?" He considered her question seriously. Resource management requires investment. Those unwilling to invest shouldn't expect equal benefits. A logical position, Emma agreed, though communities sometimes require compromises beyond strict economic calculations. Jackson raised an eyebrow. You sound like Reverend Collins. He regularly reminds me of my Christian duty to be generous with neighbors. I'm merely noting that relationships have practical value too, Emma replied. Sometimes flexibility earns cooperation, worth more than the immediate resource. Jackson fell silent, considering her words. As they approached Pine Creek, he finally spoke again. You make a valid point. I'll reconsider the water allocation plans. Emma felt a small sense of satisfaction at this acknowledgement. Perhaps their practical marriage could include intellectual partnership as well. Pine Creek appeared different in daylight than it had during her arrival. Less threatening, more ordinary. The main street featured the usual establishments of a frontier town: general store, bank, saloon, hotel, with the church and schoolhouse set slightly apart. People moved about their business, women carrying shopping baskets, men loading wagons, children darting between buildings in play. When Jackson helped Emma down from the carriage in front of the general store, activity on the street slowed noticeably. Faces turned their way, conversations paused mid-sentence. Emma held her head, smiling pleasantly but not overly eager. Mrs. Miller, Jackson said formally, I'll meet you at the schoolhouse in an hour. Will that give you sufficient time? Yes, thank you, Mr. Miller, she replied, matching his formal tone while quietly appreciating his public acknowledgement of their marriage. As Jackson strode toward the bank, Emma entered the general store, prepared to face her first real test as Mrs. Miller of Evergreen Ranch. The store fell silent as the bell above the door announced her arrival. Martha Jennings stood behind the counter, flanked by two younger women whose eyes widened at Emma's entrance. Good morning, Emma said pleasantly, removing her gloves. Mrs. Jennings, isn't it? We met briefly yesterday. Mrs. Miller, Martha exclaimed too loudly. What a surprise to see you in town so soon after your arrival, and already married. Such a whirlwind romance. The sarcasm in her tone was thinly veiled, but Emma merely smiled. Hardly a romance, Mrs. Jennings. Mr. Miller and I have a practical arrangement that suits us both. I'll be teaching. That's very modern of you, she managed, exchanging glances with the other women, though some might question marrying a man you've just met. Some might, Emma agreed pleasantly. Others might question the wisdom of passing judgment on arrangements they don't fully understand. Now, I'd like to purchase some stationery and perhaps fabric for curtains for the schoolhouse. Could you show me what you have available? For the next half hour, Emma maintained pleasant but firm conversation while selecting supplies for the school and her personal use. She answered direct questions about her background truthfully, but briefly, neither hiding nor dwelling on her past in Boston. When Martha inevitably broached the subject of the rumors, Emma met it head-on. Yes, there was a child who died under my care, the son of my employers who had contracted scarlet fever during last year's outbreak in Boston. Despite the best medical attention and my constant nursing, he succumbed, as did 11 other children. In the neighborhood, grief sometimes seeks someone to blame, which is what occurred in my case. Dr. Schmidt, the family physician, provided a letter clearing me of any negligence, which I'm happy to show anyone genuinely concerned rather than merely curious. Her calm, straightforward response left Martha temporarily speechless. The two younger women exchanged impressed glances, one of them nodding slightly in approval. By the time Emma left the general store, she had established herself as someone who would neither be cowed by gossip nor inflamed to indignation. She had made her first small step toward acceptance in Pine Creek, if not yet friendship. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a simple one-room building with peeling white paint and a small bell tower. When Emma entered, she found the interior dusty but fundamentally sound. Rows of desks faced a larger teacher's desk on a small platform. Bookshelves lined one wall, though they stood half empty. A blackboard dominated the front wall, while large windows provided good light. Emma was assessing what supplies would be needed when Jackson arrived, accompanied by a thin, elderly man with wire-rimmed spectacles. "Mrs. Miller, this is Mr. Horace Jenkins, chairman of the school board," Jackson introduced them. "He'll provide you with the details of the teaching position." Mr. Jenkins peered at Emma with undisguised curiosity. "Mr. Miller tells me you have experience as a governess. We have 28 students enrolled, ages 6 to 16, though attendance becomes irregular during planting and harvest. The previous teacher, Miss Sullivan, left rather suddenly to marry." He glanced awkwardly at Jackson. "George Simmons," Jackson finished for him, his tone neutral. "I'm aware." "Yes, well," Jenkins continued, "we've been making do with Reverend Collins teaching basic reading and arithmetic 1 day a week, but the children are falling behind. Could you begin Monday next?" "I could," Emma agreed, "though I'll need a few days to prepare lessons and organize the classroom. Is there a curriculum established?" "Miss Sullivan left her planning book," Jenkins said, moving to the teachers' desk and withdrawing a leather-bound volume from the drawer. "The standard McGuffey readers for literature and language, Watson's arithmetic series, and whatever history and science texts we have available, which I must admit are limited." Emma leafed through the planning book, noting Miss Sullivan's neat handwriting and conventional approach. "I see. I'll work with what's available and make recommendations for additional materials if needed. Does the school budget allow for supplies? Chalk, paper, perhaps some maps?" Jenkins looked uncomfortable. "The budget is quite modest, I'm afraid. The town council allocates $40 per month for the teacher's salary and another $10 for all supplies and maintenance." "I'll provide whatever additional supplies are needed," Jackson interjected. "Evergreen Ranch has a vested interest in proper education. Several of our workers have children attending the school." Jenkins appeared both relieved and slightly intimidated by this declaration. "Very generous, Mr. Miller, very generous indeed." As they left the schoolhouse, Emma noticed a small crowd had gathered at the general store, watching them with unconcealed interest. Jackson either didn't notice or chose to ignore them, helping Emma into the carriage with formal courtesy. "I need to check on a lumber order at the mill," he said. "Would you like to accompany me, or would you prefer to return to the ranch?" "I'd like to see more of the town, if you don't mind," Emma replied. "The more I understand about Pine Creek, the better I can serve as teacher." Jackson nodded approvingly. "A practical approach. The mill is just beyond the church." As they drove through town, Emma was conscious of being observed from every doorway and window. By supper time, every household in Pine Creek would be discussing the new Mrs. Miller, her appearance, her manner, her history. She would need to establish herself quickly as someone of substance rather than merely an object of curiosity. The lumber mill at the edge of town was a busy operation, with stacks of raw logs waiting to be processed and the sharp smell of fresh-cut pine permeating the air. Jackson spoke with the foreman while Emma remained in the carriage, observing the workers. Most were young men, some barely older than the students she would soon be teaching. One boy, perhaps 14, caught her attention as he struggled to stack heavy boards. "That boy seems too young for such labor," she commented, when Jackson returned. "Sam Wilson, Dr. Wilson's nephew," Jackson explained. "His father was killed in a mining accident last year. The doctor took him in, but the boy insisted on earning his keep. He attends school when he can." Emma watched the boy wipe sweat from his brow, determination evident in his thin face. "Will he be one of my students?" "If you can keep him interested. Enough to attend," Jackson said. "He's bright but restless, feels responsible for helping support his mother and sisters who live with his grandmother on a small farm outside town." This glimpse into the community's interconnected lives gave Emma much to consider as they completed their tour of Pine Creek. The town was more than just buildings and businesses. It was a web of relationships, some supportive, others strained, all complicated in the way of small communities where privacy was scarce and memories long. By the time they returned to Evergreen Ranch in the late afternoon, Emma had a clearer understanding of the world she had entered. Jackson Miller was not merely a wealthy rancher, but a central figure in the community, respected, perhaps feared by some, but undeniably influential. As his wife, she would be granted a certain position regardless of her own merits, a fact that could either ease or complicate her integration into Pine Creek society. That evening, they dined together for the first time without Mrs. Patterson's presence. The housekeeper had discreetly arranged for the table to be set in the dining room and the meal served by Lily, the younger maid, who brought dishes from the kitchen and withdrew silently. "How did you find Pine Creek?" Jackson asked as they began their meal. "Typical of frontier towns in many ways," Emma replied thoughtfully. "The social hierarchy seems well established, the bank, the church, and your ranch appearing to hold the most influence." Jackson looked mildly surprised at her analysis. "That's an accurate assessment, though Simmons challenges my position whenever possible, and Martha Jennings wields considerable power through gossip." I noticed Mrs. Jennings seems to fancy herself the arbiter of social acceptance. She mentioned that you rarely participated in town gatherings before my arrival. A faint smile touched Jackson's lips. "Did she suggest I was unsociable?" "The word reclusive may have been used," Emma admitted, along with implications that Evergreen Ranch has prospered suspiciously well compared to neighboring properties. "Envy dressed as concern," Jackson said dismissively. "Success breeds resentment in those unwilling to adapt. Simmons still ranches the way his father did 30 years ago, ignoring new breeding methods and water management techniques. Then he complains when my yields are higher. Will my presence at social functions be expected?" Emma asked directly. "I'm willing to represent Evergreen as needed, though I admit I have little patience for idle socializing." Jackson seemed pleased by this statement. "Another point of compatibility in our arrangement. I attend what's necessary for business purposes. The harvest festival, Christmas gathering, occasional town meetings. Otherwise, I prefer to focus on productive endeavors." "A sensible approach," Emma agreed, "though I will need to be more visible as the school teacher." "True, that role exists somewhat separately from your position as Mrs. Miller of Evergreen Ranch. I leave it to your judgment how to balance them." This acknowledgement of her autonomy impressed Emma. Many men would have dictated exactly how their wives should behave in public, particularly in a marriage arranged as theirs had been. As dinner concluded, Jackson surprised her with a question. "Would you care to see the library again? I have several medical texts that might interest you given your experience." The invitation represented their first Gray's Anatomy, of course, he said, placing the heavy tome on top, and Loomis on fever management, which I found particularly useful during a typhoid outbreak among the ranch hands 3 years ago. This smaller volume on medicinal plants of the Western Territories is less scientific, but has practical value in areas where pharmacies are distant. Emma examined the books with growing interest and respect. "You've studied medicine seriously." "Da necessity," Jackson explained. "When I first came here, the nearest doctor was in Helena 2 days' ride away. I learned what I could to keep my workers alive. Dr. Wilson arrived 10 years ago, but he can't be everywhere at once." "Have you performed procedures yourself?" Emma asked, curiosity overcoming propriety. Jackson nodded, rolling up his sleeve to reveal a long scar on his forearm. Set my own bone when a stallion threw me against a fence post, and delivered twins for one of the cook's daughters when Dr. Wilson was snowed in at the Sullivan place during a blizzard. Emma's professional interest was thoroughly engaged now. The twins survived. They did. Healthy 5-year-olds now, living in Billings with their mother and her husband. A rare smile crossed his face. Named them Jackson and Miller Sullivan. I consider it a mixed honor. Emma laughed, her first genuine laugh since arriving at Evergreen Ranch. The sound seemed to surprise both of them, interrupting the usual reserve that characterized their interactions. After a moment, Jackson cleared his throat. I should check the night guard rotation before retiring. Please feel free to borrow any books that interest you. Thank you, Emma said. I appreciate your willingness to share your knowledge. Not all men would be so open-minded about a woman's interest in medicine. At Evergreen, practical skills matter more than conventions, Jackson replied. Good night, Mrs. Miller. Good night, Mr. Miller, she responded, the formality somehow less distant than it had been before. As Emma selected several volumes to take to her room, she reflected on the day's developments. Their arrangement remained practical, but something had shifted subtly. A foundation of mutual respect was forming. Not the romantic connection others might expect from a marriage, but perhaps something equally valuable, recognition of each other as capable, intelligent individuals with complementary strengths. For the first time since leaving Boston, Emma felt a sense of possibility rather than mere survival. Evergreen Ranch might indeed become a true home, and Jackson Miller a true partner, in ways neither of them had anticipated when they entered their practical arrangement. The first frost of autumn painted the meadows of Evergreen Ranch with silver. When Emma awoke, she stood at her bedroom window watching ranch hands move like shadows in the pre-dawn light, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. After a month at Evergreen, Emma had developed a deep appreciation for the rhythm of ranch life, the predictable patterns that somehow never felt monotonous against the ever-changing backdrop of Montana's vast landscape. Her trunk had finally arrived from Boston the previous week, bringing the remainder of her belongings, including Dr. Schmidt's letter vouching for her character and medical competence. She had shown it to Jackson immediately, relief evident in his expression as he read the physician's glowing endorsement. You should make this public, he had suggested. But Emma declined. Those determined to think ill of me won't be swayed by a letter, she'd explained. Better to earn trust through actions than demand it through testimony. Jackson had studied her for a long moment before nodding. A wise approach, though sometimes slower than I'd prefer. Now, as Emma dressed for the day, selecting a practical wool dress in deep burgundy, she reflected on her growing understanding of her husband. Beneath Jackson's reserved exterior lay a complex man whose principles guided every decision. He valued competence above all else, showed loyalty to those who earned it, and possessed a quiet generosity he seemed almost embarrassed by, like his anonymous donation of coal to heat the schoolhouse, which he hadn't mentioned until Emma thanked him after discovering it from Sam Wilson. Their relationship had evolved into a comfortable partnership focused on shared responsibilities. Jackson sought her opinion on ranch matters with increasing frequency, while Emma had begun to understand the operation's complexities, the breeding programs, water management systems, and market considerations that occupied Jackson's thoughts. They still maintained separate bedrooms and a formal address in private, but to others, they presented a united front that was gradually becoming less performance and more reality. Breakfast awaited Emma in the dining room. Fresh bread, preserves, and coffee prepared by Mrs. Patterson, who had gradually warmed to her new mistress as Emma proved herself capable and respectful of established routines. The housekeeper handed Emma a sealed envelope as she poured her coffee. This arrived with yesterday's mail. I forgot to give it to you last night. Emma recognized the handwriting immediately. Sophia Peterson, her friend from Boston and daughter of the family who had briefly employed Emma after the Hartwell tragedy. She waited until Mrs. Patterson left before opening it, suddenly anxious about news from her former life. The letter contained startling information. James Whitcomb had continued spreading rumors about Emma's role in Thomas Hartwell's death, expanding his accusations to include misappropriation of family valuables. More disturbing, he had recently traveled west on business, possibly to Helena or even Pine Creek itself. He speaks openly of exposing your true character to your new community, Sophia wrote. Father believes his obsession stems from guilt. It was his recommendation of a particular treatment that may have hastened Thomas's decline, not your nursing. Be cautious, dear friend. This man seems determined to damage your reputation further. Emma folded the letter carefully, troubled by its implications. Jackson had received no additional telegrams from Whitcomb, nor had she heard his name mentioned. In town gossip, if he had indeed traveled west, he had not yet reached Pine Creek, but the possibility of his arrival cast a shadow over her gradually improving situation. She debated whether to share this information with Jackson. Their relationship, while developing into mutual respect, still maintained certain boundaries. Personal histories remained largely unexamined territory, with both preferring to focus on present responsibilities rather than past difficulties. The decision was postponed when Jackson himself entered the dining room, his expression unusually troubled. "There's a situation at the north property line," he said without preamble. "Simmons claims our cattle broke through his fence and trampled a field he was preparing for winter wheat. He's demanding compensation and threatening legal action." Emma set aside her personal concerns. "Do you believe our cattle are responsible?" Jackson's jaw tightened. "Possible but unlikely. That section of fence was inspected just last week. If there was damage, it's more likely deliberate than accidental." "You suspect Simmons damaged his own fence to blame Evergreen Ranch?" "It wouldn't be the first time he's tried such tactics." Jackson poured himself coffee, remaining standing as though too agitated to sit. "I'm riding out there now with Curtis to assess the situation. I may be late returning." Emma nodded, understanding the implications. Property disputes between ranchers could escalate quickly, particularly when old rivalries were involved. George, Simmons's antagonism toward Jackson had only intensified since Emma's arrival and appointment as schoolteacher, positions his wife Rebecca had clearly expected to occupy in Pine Creek society. "Would you like me to accompany you?" Emma offered. "An impartial witness might be valuable." Jackson considered this, then shook his head. "Simmons is unpredictable when angry. I'd prefer you not be exposed to that." "I'm hardly delicate." "Jackson," Emma said mildly. It was the first time she had used his given name without the formal Mr. Miller, and the shift seemed to surprise them both. After a brief pause, he responded, "I know you're not, Emma, but this situation requires a particular approach. I'll handle it directly." The reciprocal use of her given name didn't escape her notice, a small but significant shift in their carefully constructed formality. "As you think best," she conceded. "I have school preparations anyway. We're beginning geography lessons on the eastern states today." Jackson nodded, finishing his coffee quickly. At the door, he hesitated. "If I'm not back by evening, don't worry. These negotiations sometimes extend." After he departed, Emma finished breakfast quickly and prepared for her day at the schoolhouse. As she gathered her lesson materials, Sophia's warning about James Whitcomb returned to her thoughts. His possible presence in the territory added a complication she hadn't anticipated. If he arrived in Pine Creek while Jackson was occupied with the Simmons dispute, she might face his accusations alone. The school day progressed smoothly despite Emma's distraction. Her 28 students had adjusted to her teaching methods. Even the most education had always been her passion. even during her years with the Hartwells, when her responsibilities expanded to include household management and informal medical assistance. Her thoughts turned to Thomas Hartwell, the bright, curious 7-year-old, whose death had altered her life's course. She had loved the boy almost as her own, reading to him for hours, answering his endless questions about the world, nursing him through childhood illnesses long before the scarlet fever that finally claimed him. James Whitcomb's accusations had wounded her not just professionally, but personally, suggesting she had somehow failed the child she had cherished. A commotion outside interrupted these painful memories. The classroom door burst open, and Martha Jennings rushed in, face flushed with excitement. "Mrs. Miller, you must come quickly. There's been an accident at the lumber mill. Several men injured when a stack collapsed." Emma rose immediately. "Children, remain in your seats and continue your work. Alice," she addressed a responsible 14-year-old, "please supervise until I return." Without waiting for Martha's reaction, Emma grabbed her medical bag from beneath her desk. She had taken to keeping it with her after treating several minor injuries at school, and followed the storekeeper outside. A crowd had gathered near the mill, the sound of shouting and pained cries carrying across the town square. As they hurried toward the scene, Martha provided fragmented details. At least 3 men trapped. Dr. Wilson out at the Sullivan farm delivering a baby. Sent riders to fetch him, but it may be hours. The lumber mill was chaos when they arrived. Workers scrambled to move heavy timbers that had collapsed onto several men. The mill foreman shouted instructions, his face pale with shock. Blood stained the sawdust-covered ground. Emma assessed the situation rapidly, years of assisting Dr. Schmidt during emergencies guiding her response. "We need to stabilize the remaining lumber before removing more weight," she called to the foreman. "Those crossbeams could shift and cause further injury." The man looked at her in surprise, but the authority in her voice prompted immediate compliance. He directed several workers to secure the partially collapsed stack, while others continued carefully removing lumber from the trapped men. Emma turned to Martha. "Go to Dr. Wilson's office. His housekeeper knows where he keeps emergency supplies. Bring bandages, laudanum if available, and clean sheets torn into strips." As Martha hurried away, Emma approached the first victim being freed from the debris, a young man with a severely crushed leg, blood pumping alarmingly from a torn artery. "I need belts, rope, anything to use as tourniquets," she commanded, dropping to her knees beside him. Someone handed her a leather belt, which she wrapped above the wound, twisting it tight with a stick to control the bleeding. "What are you doing?" demanded George Simmons, who had apparently arrived from his ranch upon hearing of the accident. "You have no authority to treat these men." Emma didn't look up, focused on stabilizing the injured worker. "There's no doctor available. Mr. Simmons, these men will bleed to death without immediate attention." "She's right, George," said the mill foreman, wiping blood from his own minor head wound. "Jim here's already lost too much blood to wait for Doc Wilson." For the next hour, Emma worked methodically, directing the removal of injured men from the debris, assessing wounds, and providing emergency treatment. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she cleaned wounds, applied pressure to stop bleeding, and stabilized what appeared to be a broken arm and several crushed ribs. By the time Dr. Wilson finally arrived, she had treated 5 injured workers, potentially saving the lives of 2 with severe bleeding. The doctor surveyed the scene, taking in Emma's blood-stained dress and the organized way she had arranged the injured men according to severity. "Well done, Mrs. Miller," he said quietly, kneeling beside her to examine her tourniquet on the young man's leg. "This was properly applied. You've likely saved his leg, if not his life." "The artery was partially severed," Emma explained professionally. "I've slowed the bleeding but couldn't stop it completely. He needs surgical repair." Dr. Wilson nodded, studying her with new respect. You've had medical training beyond basic first aid. I assisted Dr. Alexander Schmidt in Boston for several years, Emma confirmed, primarily with the Hartwell family's care, but also during emergencies in their neighborhood. Schmidt's practical treatment of childhood diseases, the doctor asked, naming a respected medical text. Emma nodded, surprised. You're familiar with his work? I studied under him briefly at Harvard Medical School, Dr. Wilson replied. An excellent physician. If you trained with Alexander Schmidt, you're better qualified than most assistants I've encountered. He glanced around at the injured men. I could use your help transporting these men to my office for further treatment, if you're willing. Of course, Emma agreed, ignoring the murmurs from the gathering crowd. This was no time for social considerations. Men's lives hung in the balance. As they worked together to move the injured to the doctor's office, Emma became aware of the stares following her. Martha Jennings was whispering urgently to a group of women, while George Simmons engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with several ranchers. The reactions ranged from open admiration to suspicious glances, but Emma focused solely on her patients. By late afternoon, all 5 injured men had been treated and stabilized in Dr. Wilson's small hospital room behind his office. The young man with the severed artery had required delicate surgery, which Emma had assisted with, handling instruments and managing bleeding with the competence of a trained nurse. As they washed blood from their hands in the doctor's basin, Wilson spoke quietly. You have genuine talent, Mrs. Miller. It's wasted teaching multiplication tables. I enjoy teaching, Emma replied, though I admit I've missed medical work. Pine Creek could use someone with your skills, the doctor said thoughtfully. I'm not getting any younger, and emergencies like today's demonstrate the need for trained assistance. Would you consider working with me occasionally? Perhaps 1 day a week to start, more during emergencies? The offer was unexpected, but deeply appealing. I would need to discuss it with my husband, Emma said carefully, and the school board might have concerns about divided attention. Jackson's a practical man, Wilson replied. He'll recognize the value of having additional medical knowledge available at Evergreen Ranch. As for the school board, I'm a member myself. I can handle their concerns. Emma considered the proposal, aware that accepting would further complicate her position in Pine Creek. The traditional role of a rancher's wife didn't include medical practice, and some would view it as inappropriately masculine work for a woman. Yet the opportunity to use skills she had developed over years of dedicated study was tremendously tempting. Let me speak with Jackson first, she finally said. Today's events may have already reached him through other channels, and I should explain my involvement directly. Dr. Wilson agreed, and Emma departed after ensuring all patients were stable. As she walked through town toward the schoolhouse to collect her belongings, she noticed the changed reactions from townspeople. Some nodded respectfully, while others deliberately crossed the street to avoid her. Martha Jennings stood outside, a store with Rebecca Simmons, both women watching Emma with expressions that mingled dislike with something new. Fear. Emma understood their reaction. Women in frontier towns were expected to fulfill traditional roles: wife, mother, teacher perhaps, but certainly not medical practitioner. By demonstrating knowledge typically reserved for men, she had disrupted the careful social order. Some would appreciate her skills when needed, but many would resent the challenge to established boundaries. At the schoolhouse, Emma found Sam Wilson waiting anxiously. Mrs. Miller, everyone's talking about how you saved those men at the mill. Is it true you did surgery like a real doctor? I assisted your uncle with necessary medical procedures, Emma corrected gently. Dr. Wilson is an excellent physician who would have managed without me, though perhaps not as quickly with so many injured at once. Sam's expression was pure admiration. My uncle says you know more medicine than most doctors out west. He says you should be teaching at a medical college instead of here. Your uncle is very kind, but exaggerates my qualifications. Emma smiled, gathering her teaching materials. Now, I must return to Evergreen Ranch. Mr. Miller will be wondering where I am. He already knows, Sam said excitedly. Riders went out to all the ranches about the accident. They say Mr. Simmons was real angry about you treating his workers without permission, but the mill foreman told him to shut his mouth because you saved Jim Porter's life when he was bleeding out. This news didn't surprise Emma. In a community as small as Pine Creek, information traveled quickly, often with embellishments that transform simple actions into heroics or scandals, depending on the teller's perspective. As she drove the school wagon back to Evergreen Ranch, Emma contemplated how Jackson might react to her public display of medical knowledge. Their relationship had gradually evolved toward mutual respect, but she had never explicitly demonstrated her full capabilities. In Pine Creek, her actions today would be considered either remarkably brave or scandalously inappropriate, with little middle ground. Evergreen Ranch appeared unusually active when Emma arrived. Extra horses stood in the corral, suggesting visitors. As David took the wagon reins from her, Emma noticed dried blood on her sleeve that she'd missed when washing up at Dr. Wilson's office. Mr. Miller returned about an hour ago, ma'am, David informed her. He's in the main house with Mr. Norris and some of the other ranchers. Emma thanked him and entered through the kitchen, hoping to change her blood-stained dress before encountering Jackson and his guests. Mrs. Patterson intercepted her immediately, eyes widening at Emma's appearance. Mrs. Miller, we've heard about the accident in town. Are you injured? No, this isn't my blood, Emma assured her. I assisted with treating the injured men until Dr. Wilson arrived. I'd like to change before joining Mr. Miller and his guests. They're discussing the accident and your involvement, Mrs. Patterson said, her tone revealing nothing of her own opinion on the matter. Mr. Miller asked to be informed when you returned. Emma sighed internally. There would be no opportunity to collect her thoughts before explaining her actions. Very well. Please let him know I've arrived and will join them shortly after making myself presentable. Upstairs, Emma quickly changed into a clean navy dress, washing the last traces of blood from her hands and face. She removed pins from her hair, which had come loose during her work, twisting it back into a neat arrangement. The face that looked back at her from the mirror appeared composed, though her eyes revealed tension as she prepared to face whatever reaction awaited her. In the parlor, conversation stopped abruptly when Emma entered. Jackson stood near the fireplace with Curtis Norris and 3 other ranchers Emma recognized from town council meetings. All turned to stare at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to frank appraisal. Emma, Jackson said, stepping forward. His face revealed nothing of his thoughts. These gentlemen were just discussing the incident at the lumber mill. I hope the reports of the injured men are favorable, Emma replied calmly. When I left Dr. Wilson's office, all was stable, though Jim Porter's condition remains serious. Porter would be dead if not for you, according to Wilson's nephew, said one of the ranchers, Frank Davis, whose property adjoined Evergreen to the east. Boy says you controlled the bleeding when nobody else knew how. I merely applied basic medical knowledge until Dr. Wilson could arrive, Emma explained. Anyone with proper training would have done the same. But that's just it, isn't it? Curtis interjected. Nobody else had proper training. Doc Wilson was miles away delivering a baby and 5 men might have died waiting. Jackson watched Emma carefully as the men discussed her actions, his expression unreadable. Finally, he addressed the group. Gentlemen, I appreciate your stopping by with this information. I'd like to speak with my wife privately now. The men departed with respectful nods to Emma, murmuring their appreciation for her assistance during the emergency. When the door closed behind them, Jackson remained by the fireplace, studying Emma with an intensity that made her straighten her spine in unconscious preparation for confrontation. "You didn't mention the extent of your medical knowledge," he said finally. "I told you I had assisted Dr. Schmidt with the Hartwell family's care," Emma replied. "I didn't specify the range of procedures I'd learned because it seemed unnecessary to our arrangement at the time." "Unnecessary?" Jackson's eyebrow rose. "You performed emergency surgery in the middle of Pine Creek today, and you didn't think your capabilities might be relevant information for your husband." Emma felt a flash of irritation at his tone. "I assisted with necessary medical treatment during an emergency when no physician was available. Would you have preferred I stand aside and watch men bleed to death because treating them might cause gossip?" "That's not what I said," Jackson countered, his own frustration evident. "I'm not concerned about gossip. I'm concerned about discovering the extent of my wife's abilities from Frank Davis rather than from her directly." This perspective hadn't occurred to Emma. She had been preparing to defend her actions as medically necessary, not to explain why she hadn't fully disclosed her skills. The realization that Jackson's primary concern was being uninformed rather than socially embarrassed shifted her understanding of the situation. "You're right," she acknowledged, her posture relaxing slightly. "I should have been more forthcoming about my medical training. It became such a contentious issue in Boston that I developed the habit of downplaying it." Jackson moved from the fireplace to stand closer to her. "Emma, I married you because your letters showed intelligence and practicality. If you've developed valuable medical skills, that's an asset to Evergreen Ranch, not a liability." Relief washed through her. "Then you're not opposed to my having treated those men today?" "Opposed?" Jackson actually smiled slightly. "Curtis tells me George Simmons nearly had apoplexy watching you save his workers' lives while he stood by helplessly. I'd have paid good money to witness that." The tension between them dissolved into unexpected laughter, a shared moment of genuine connection that felt more intimate than any previous interaction. When it subsided, Jackson's expression grew serious again, though without the earlier frustration. "Dr. Wilson sent a message asking permission to engage you as his assistant one day weekly. I told him the decision was yours to make, assuming it doesn't interfere with your teaching responsibilities." Emma blinked in surprise. "You've already discussed it?" "Wilson rode out personally after stabilizing his patients," Jackson explained. "He seems quite impressed with your abilities. And you have no objection to your wife working as a medical assistant?" Emma pressed, still finding his acceptance difficult to believe after her experiences in Boston. Jackson considered her question carefully. "Evergreen operates on principles of practical efficiency, Emma. If you possess skills that benefit this community, discouraging their use would be wasteful. The only relevant questions are whether you wish to take on this additional role and how we manage any negative reactions from those with more traditional expectations." His response embodied everything Emma had come to appreciate about Jackson Miller: his pragmatism, his independence from social constraints when they conflicted with practical needs, his recognition of her as a partner with autonomy rather than a possession to be directed. "I would like to work with Dr. Wilson," she admitted. "Medicine has always been as much my calling as education, though circumstances prevented formal training." "Then inform him of your decision," Jackson nodded. "As for managing Pine Creek's response, we'll address that together. Evergreen Ranch stands behind its own." The possessive "its own" might have bothered Emma in another context, but here it signified acceptance, not just as his mail-order bride or convenient teacher, but as a valued member of the enterprise he had built. That acceptance, offered without romantic pretense but with genuine respect, meant more than pretty words or passionate declarations ever could. "Thank you," she said simply. Jackson nodded, then moved toward his study. At the doorway, he paused. "By the way, I resolved the situation with Simmons. The fence damage was clearly deliberate, tool marks on the posts. But with witnesses present, he agreed to withdraw his complaints in exchange for a reduced water allocation from the creek during spring runoff." Emma recognized this as a significant concession on Jackson's part, one he had previously refused to consider when she suggested flexibility might prove strategically valuable. "That seems a fair resolution. I found myself considering what you said about relationships having practical value," Jackson admitted. "Sometimes the appearance of compromise yields more than rigid principle." With that acknowledgement of her influence on his thinking, he disappeared into his study, leaving Emma with the realization that their practical arrangement had developed into something neither had anticipated, a true partnership based on mutual respect and growing understanding. That evening, as they dined together in companionable conversation, discussing both the lumber mill accident and the Simmons negotiation in equal detail, Emma considered telling Jackson about Sophia's letter warning of James Whitcomb's possible approach. The moment seemed right for such confidences, with the barriers between them lowered by the day's events. Yet something held her back. Perhaps the desire to preserve this newfound harmony a little longer before introducing fresh complications, or possibly the hope that Whitcomb's threats would remain distant concerns rather than immediate problems. Whatever her reasoning, Emma chose to keep this particular worry to herself for now, focusing instead on the unexpected possibilities opening before her at Evergreen Ranch. What neither Emma nor Jackson could know, Whitcomb adjusted his cuffs, a gesture that seemed calculated to project confidence. "Justice, Mr. Miller. Young Thomas Hartwell deserves justice, and your wife deserves to face the consequences of her actions rather than hiding behind a hasty marriage in an obscure frontier town." "And what form would this justice take?" Jackson asked, his expression hardening. "You've already attempted to poison Pine Creek against my wife with your telegram. What more do you want?" "I want Emma Hayes to admit her negligence publicly and return to Boston to face proper inquiry," Whitcomb declared. "The medical board has questions about her unauthorized treatments. Her presence here, practicing medicine without credentials, only compounds her offenses." Jackson's laugh was short and without humor. "You expect me to deliver my wife to Boston for some form of trial based on allegations that have already been dismissed by the attending physician? You've wasted your journey, Mr. Whitcomb." The lawyer's composure slipped momentarily, revealing something ugly beneath his professional veneer. "Your wife is a fraud, Miller. Whatever story she's told you about her background, her qualifications, even her appearance, it's all carefully constructed deception. The real Emma Hayes is not the woman you think you married." Before Jackson could respond, the study door opened. Emma stood in the doorway, her teaching clothes slightly dusty from the ride from town, her expression calm but determined. "The real Emma Hayes is quite capable of speaking for herself, Mr. Whitcomb." Both men turned toward her, Whitcomb with visible displeasure at the interruption, Jackson with carefully neutral attention. Emma stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind her. "I thought I might find you here," she said to Whitcomb. "When you didn't return to the school after dismissal, I assumed you'd chosen the direct approach with my husband instead." "Mrs. Miller," Whitcomb's tone dripped with condescension, "I was just explaining to your husband the serious nature of the situation in Boston. Perhaps you'd care to tell him yourself about the missing items from Mrs. Hartwell's jewelry case, or the experimental treatments you administered against medical advice." Emma's chin lifted slightly, the only indication that his accusation had affected her. "Those are fresh allegations, Mr. Whitcomb, and entirely false. I stole nothing from the Hartwell household. As for treatments, I followed Dr. Schmidt's protocol exactly, refusing your suggested alternatives precisely because they lacked medical endorsement. You expect me to believe. I expect nothing from you, Emma interrupted, her voice steady. You've carried your guilt westward like baggage, Mr. Whitcomb, hoping to unload it by transferring responsibility for Thomas's death to me. But we both know whose suggestion precipitated his final decline. The lawyer's face flushed dark red. How dare you suggest? I suggest nothing. I state facts, Emma continued. I have Dr. Schmidt's letters documenting the entire course of Thomas's illness, including your intervention and its consequences. I've kept silent out of respect for the Hartwells' grief, but I won't allow you to destroy what I've built here with false accusations. Jackson observed this exchange with mounting appreciation for his wife's composure. She stood her ground without raising her voice, her arguments logical and direct, exactly the approach that would be most effective in Pine Creek, where emotional displays were viewed with suspicion. Mrs. Hartwell knows the truth, Whitcomb insisted, though his confidence seemed to waver. She'll testify to your negligence. Mrs. Hartwell is a grieving mother who needed someone to blame, Emma replied softly. I have never held her responsible for believing what you told her, but her grief doesn't transform your lies into truth, Mr. Whitcomb. A tense silence filled the study. Jackson stepped forward, positioning himself beside Emma in a subtle but clear demonstration of solidarity. Mr. Whitcomb, it seems you have two choices. You can continue these baseless accusations, in which case I'll be forced to consider them slander against my wife and respond accordingly. Or you can acknowledge that your mission here has failed and return to Boston with whatever dignity remains intact. Whitcomb glanced between them, perhaps recognizing for the first time that he faced not a vulnerable woman alone, but a united partnership. His hand tightened on his walking stick. This isn't finished. The people of Pine Creek deserve to know who they've welcomed into their community. On that, Jackson said coldly, we agree completely, which is why I've invited several prominent citizens to dinner this evening, including Dr. Wilson, Reverend Collins, and Frederick Tate from the bank. I thought they might appreciate hearing directly from someone who knew my wife in Boston. This announcement clearly shocked both Whitcomb and Emma, though Emma recovered quickly, giving Jackson a glance that mingled surprise with something like admiration. Dinner is at 7, Jackson continued smoothly. You're welcome to present your concerns then, Mr. Whitcomb, in the presence of those whose opinions matter most in this community. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to depart on tomorrow morning's eastbound train instead. Whitcomb's expression revealed his calculation. To refuse would suggest weakness, yet to accept meant presenting his accusations before a potentially hostile audience rather than spreading them through private conversations, as he had, presumably, planned. I'll attend, he finally said stiffly. Perhaps your Pine Creek luminaries will appreciate learning about Boston's standards of medical care, which apparently exceed those of this a frontier establishment. After Whitcomb departed to prepare for dinner at his hotel, Emma turned to Jackson, one eyebrow raised in silent question. You didn't actually arrange a dinner party in the few hours since Sam brought news of Whitcomb's arrival, she stated, rather than asked. No, Jackson admitted, a rare smile touching his lips, but I will now. Whitcomb isn't the only one who can bluff when necessary. Emma's tension eased slightly. Thank you for your support. His appearance was unexpected. Not entirely, Jackson corrected. You received a letter warning of his possible arrival. I saw it on your desk last week when looking for the school ledger. You didn't mention it. A flicker of embarrassment crossed Emma's face. I should have told you. I hoped he might not actually come. Hope is fine. Preparation is better, Jackson said, not unkindly. No more secrets between us, Emma. They only provide openings for men like Whitcomb. She nodded her agreement, appreciating his directness rather than feeling chastised by it. No more secrets, though I'm not sure how we'll arrange a dinner party for Pine Creek's most influential citizens with only 3 hours' notice. Mrs. Patterson has managed more difficult tasks, Jackson replied confidently, and people here are curious enough about Whitcomb that they'll rearrange their schedules to attend. As predicted, Mrs. Patterson rose to the challenge with remarkable efficiency, dispatching riders to deliver invitations while directing the kitchen staff in preparing an impressive meal on short notice. By 6:30, the dining room gleamed, with polished silver and crystal rarely used during Jackson and Emma's quiet dinners together. Emma dressed carefully in her finest gown, a deep green silk she had brought from Boston but never worn at Evergreen Ranch. As she fastened pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother, she contemplated the evening ahead. Whitcomb would undoubtedly present his accusations in the most damaging light possible. Her response would determine her standing in Pine Creek for years to come. The guests began arriving promptly at 7. Dr. Wilson came first, accompanied by his nephew Sam, whose presence surprised Emma until the doctor explained, "The boy insisted on coming. Says he won't let that Boston fellow talk against his teacher without someone speaking up for the students." Reverend Collins arrived with Frederick Tate from the bank, followed closely by Martha Jennings and her husband. Emma raised an eyebrow at Jackson when the storekeeper entered. Martha had been the primary source of gossip about Emma since her arrival, but he merely shrugged slightly, indicating the strategic value of including even potential adversaries. Most surprising was the arrival of George and Rebecca Simmons. Despite the recent fence dispute and Rebecca's obvious dislike of Emma, Jackson had included his rivals in the gathering. "Water rights necessitate certain social concessions," he murmured to Emma as they greeted the couple. The Simmons responded with stiff politeness, their curiosity about the hastily arranged dinner clearly overriding their animosity. James Whitcomb was the last to arrive, wearing an expression of smug confidence that faltered momentarily when he saw the assembled company. He had clearly expected a smaller, more intimate gathering where his credentials would automatically command respect. Instead, he found himself facing a diverse group of Pine Creek citizens, many regarding him with open skepticism. Dinner proceeded with the forced pleasantries of people anticipating conflict. Martha Jennings made several attempts to direct conversation toward Emma's background in Boston. "Mr. Whitcomb, I understand you've come all the way from Boston regarding some concern about Mrs. Miller's past employment. Perhaps you'd share what brings you such a distance." The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye turned to Whitcomb, who set down his dessert fork with deliberate precision. "I represent the Hartwell family of Boston," he began, his tone formal. "Their son, Thomas, died while under the care of the woman you now know as Mrs. Miller. Her negligence contributed directly to his death, despite the presence of qualified medical professionals who offered alternative treatments." "That's a serious accusation," Dr. Wilson responded immediately. "As the physician in Pine Creek, I'd be interested in the specific medical details of this case." Whitcomb hesitated, clearly unprepared for technical medical questioning. The boy contracted scarlet fever. Miss Hayes, Mrs. Miller, insisted on outdated treatments rather than newer methods that might have saved him. "These newer methods being what, exactly?" Dr. Wilson pressed. "I'm not a physician," Whitcomb admitted reluctantly. "But the consulting specialist suggested treatments that Miss Hayes refused to implement." Emma spoke for the first time since the topic arose. "The consulting specialist Mr. Whitcomb refers to was not a physician at all, but Mr. Whitcomb himself, who had read an article in a medical journal about experimental treatments not approved by any medical board. Dr. Schmidt, the attending physician, rejected these suggestions as dangerous and unproven." Dr. Wilson's eyebrows rose. "You suggested medical treatments without qualification, Mr. Whitcomb. That's concerning." My only concern was for my nephew's welfare. Whitcomb snapped, his composure cracking. While this woman, Dr. Wilson interrupted firmly, demonstrated medical knowledge during our recent lumber mill emergency that saved at least 2 lives. I've reviewed her correspondence with Dr. Alexander Schmidt, whom I know by reputation to be an excellent physician. His assessment of Mrs. Miller's competence aligns precisely with what I've observed personally. Frederick Tate leaned forward, his banker's instinct for risk assessment engaged. Dr. Wilson, are you saying you find no merit in Mr. Whitcomb's accusations regarding Mrs. Miller's medical practices? None whatsoever, Wilson stated flatly. In fact, I've engaged Mrs. Miller as my assistant 1 day weekly, with full confidence in her abilities. Martha Jennings couldn't contain herself. But what about the other accusations? The stolen jewelry, the inappropriate attachment to the child? Emma turned to face Martha directly. There was no stolen jewelry, Mrs. Jennings. That allegation appears to be entirely new, perhaps created for this audience. She shifted her gaze to Whitcomb. As for my attachment to Thomas Hartwell, I loved him as anyone would love a child in their care for 5 years. That attachment made his loss painful, not improper. This all seems rather personal, Reverend Collins observed quietly. Mr. Whitcomb, may I ask what you hope to accomplish by bringing these matters to Pine Creek? The directness of the question seemed to catch Whitcomb off guard. He glanced around the table, perhaps recognizing for the first time that his audience was not responding as anticipated. I sought justice, he said stiffly, and to warn this community about a qualified teacher and medical assistant who has served Pine Creek admirably since her arrival. George Simmons interrupted unexpectedly. All eyes turned to him in surprise, none wider than his wife Rebecca's. I've had my differences with the Millers, he continued, but even I can recognize when someone's carrying a personal vendetta too far. My foreman, Jim Porter, would be dead if not for Mrs. Miller's quick action at the lumber mill. This support from such an unexpected quarter created a palpable shift in the room's atmosphere. Whitcomb glanced from face to face, finding no allies. Among the gathered citizens, you people are being deceived, he insisted, desperation edging his voice. She isn't who she pretends to be. Even her appearance has changed to facilitate this deception. Sam Wilson, who had remained silent throughout dinner, suddenly spoke up. Mrs. Miller teaches us that judging people by their looks is shallow and wrong. Maybe in Boston that's how you do things, but here we care more about what people can do and how they treat others. A murmur of approval followed the boy's straightforward declaration. Martha Jennings nodded despite herself, while Frederick Tate smiled approvingly at the young man's wisdom. Jackson, who had observed the exchange with careful attention, finally spoke. Mr. Whitcomb, it seems your concerns have been heard and evaluated by those whose judgment matters in Pine Creek. Is there anything else you wish to add before we consider this matter concluded? Whitcomb's face had reddened with frustration and embarrassment. You're all being taken in by a carefully constructed facade. The woman sitting at this table is not the plain, unremarkable Emma Hayes who served the Hartwells. She's transformed herself completely for her new role. Emma met his accusation calmly. The woman at this table is exactly who she has always been, Mr. Whitcomb. The photograph I sent to Mr. Miller was taken during the darkest period of my life, when grief and exhaustion had taken their toll. What you see now is simply what recovery looks like. Rebecca Simmons, who had remained silent throughout the evening, suddenly spoke. I understand transformation, Mr. Whitcomb. Her voice was quiet, but clear. When I came to Pine Creek as the new school teacher, I was recovering from my father's death and my family's financial collapse. Those who knew me before would hardly have recognized the person I became here. She glanced briefly at her husband, then back to Whitcomb. People change based on their circumstances. Only those with the most rigid minds find that threatening. This unexpected support from the woman, who had been Emma's most obvious critic, left Whitcomb visibly deflated. He pushed his dessert plate away, his appetite apparently gone. "I see I've wasted my journey," he said stiffly. "The standards of Boston clearly don't apply in this frontier community." "On that," Dr. Wilson said dryly, "we can agree. Our standards require evidence rather than insinuation, practical skill rather than social position, and direct contribution rather than distant criticism. By those measures, Mrs. Miller has proven herself a valuable member of Pine Creek in ways you've failed to understand." The dinner concluded shortly thereafter, with Whitcomb departing first, barely mumbling thanks for the meal before hurrying into the night. The other guests lingered, conversation flowing more naturally now that the tension had dissipated. As Martha Jennings prepared to leave, she paused beside Emma. "I may have misjudged you, Mrs. Miller," she admitted quietly, "though I still say you and Mr. Miller conducted your courtship with unseemly haste." Emma surprised herself by laughing. "On that point, Mrs. Jennings, I won't disagree, but sometimes the most practical arrangements yield unexpected rewards." After the last guest departed, Emma and Jackson stood together on the porch, watching. The carriage lights disappeared down the long drive toward town. The autumn night was clear, stars brilliant above the dark silhouette of Eagle Ridge Mountains. "Whitcomb will leave on tomorrow's train," Jackson predicted. "He knows when he's been defeated." "Yes," Emma agreed, "though I'm not naive enough to believe this is the end of his accusations. He'll likely continue in Boston, where his social standing gives his words more weight." "Does that concern you?" Emma considered the question seriously. "Not as it once would have. Boston seems very distant now, in more ways than geographical miles." Jackson nodded, understanding her meaning. "Pine Creek may not offer the cultural advantages of Boston, but it does provide a certain clarity of perspective. People here judge based on what they see directly, not on rumor or social convention." "Not all people," Emma corrected gently, "but enough to make a life worthwhile." They stood in companionable silence for a moment before Jackson spoke again. "I was surprised by Simmons's support this evening, particularly given our recent dispute. I treated his foreman's injuries without hesitation," Emma pointed out. "Even rivals recognize practical value when it affects their interests directly." Jackson glanced at her with new appreciation. "You've adapted to frontier thinking remarkably well for someone raised in Boston society." Emma smiled slightly. "Perhaps I was always more suited to direct approaches than social niceties. In Boston, that made me unsuitable for many positions. Here, it seems almost an advantage." "It is," Jackson confirmed, "particularly as my wife." The simple statement contained more warmth than any flowery declaration might have. In their brief marriage, they had moved from strangers bound by practical arrangement to partners united by mutual respect. The transition had happened so gradually that Emma hadn't marked its progress until this moment. "I've been thinking about Dr. Wilson's offer," she said, changing the subject slightly. "Working with him one day weekly while maintaining my teaching responsibilities seems manageable, but I'd also like to we could convert the small cabin near the bunkhouse into a treatment space." "Exactly what I was thinking," Emma agreed. "It could also serve as a dispensary for basic medicines and first aid supplies. This easy exchange of ideas, the natural extension of their partnership into new areas of mutual benefit, felt entirely right to both of them. Their marriage had begun as a business arrangement, but had developed into something far more substantial, a true partnership based on complementary strengths and shared purpose. Later that night, as Emma prepared for bed, a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Jackson standing in the hallway, holding a small wooden box. "I meant to give you this earlier, before Whitcomb's arrival disrupted our usual routine," he explained, extending the box toward her. Emma accepted it curiously, opening the lid to find a beautiful stethoscope nested in velvet lining. The instrument was clearly high quality, with gleaming brass fittings and polished wooden earpieces. "Dr. Wilson mentioned your old one was damaged during the lumber mill emergency," Jackson explained. "I ordered this from Chicago when he agreed to take you on as his assistant." The thoughtfulness of the gift, practical yet perfectly aligned with her deepest interests, touched Emma profoundly. "Thank you. It's exactly what I needed." "You've brought unexpected benefits to Evergreen Ranch," Jackson said, his usual reserve softening slightly. "Not just your medical knowledge or teaching abilities, but your perspective. I find myself valuing your opinions on matters I never anticipated discussing with anyone." Emma recognized this statement for what it was. Not a declaration of romantic love, but something possibly more meaningful between two practical people who had found unexpected connection. "I feel the same. This arrangement has provided more than security or position. It's given me purpose again, after I feared I'd lost it forever in Boston." Jackson nodded, understanding precisely what she meant. "Good night, Emma." "Good night, Jackson." As Emma closed her door, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. When she had agreed to become a mail-order bride, she had expected a purely practical exchange, her domestic and educational skills for Jackson Miller's financial security and position in the community. Neither of them had anticipated the partnership that would develop, built not on romantic notions, but on something possibly more enduring: mutual respect, shared purpose, and growing trust. Outside her window, the vast Montana landscape stretched. Under starlight, so different from Boston's crowded streets, Emma had found her place here, not despite the challenges, but because of them. The woman who had fled Boston in disgrace had transformed into Mrs. Miller of Evergreen Ranch, not by changing who she fundamentally was, but by finally having the space and freedom to become fully herself. As winter approached Pine Creek, the town's initial curiosity about Emma gradually transformed into acceptance. Her position as school teacher was secured by the children's improved performance and enthusiasm. Her role as Dr. Wilson's assistant became an acknowledged community benefit rather than a controversial anomaly. Even Martha Jennings now referred to our Mrs. Miller with a certain proprietary pride when visitors remarked on Pine Creek's unusual medical arrangements. James Whitcomb had indeed departed on the eastbound train as predicted, his mission unfulfilled, his accusations falling on skeptical ears. Whether he would continue his campaign in Boston remained unknown, but the distance, both physical and psychological, rendered his efforts increasingly irrelevant to Emma's new life. At Evergreen Ranch, the small cabin near the bunkhouse had been transformed into a functional medical station where Emma held weekly clinics for the ranch hands and their families. Jackson had expanded her budget twice already as the benefits of regular medical care became evident in reduced work absences and improved morale among the workers. Their marriage had settled into a rhythm that suited them both. Separate in some respects, united in others, always founded on honest communication and shared goals. Whether this arrangement would ever develop the romantic dimensions that others might expect remained uncertain and unforced. For now, the deep respect and growing affection between them provided a foundation stronger than many marriages based on more conventional beginnings. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly outside the windows of Aspen Lodge, Emma placed the final ornament on the tree Jackson had brought from the North Ridge. The ranch hands and their families would gather tomorrow for the annual Evergreen celebration, a tradition Jackson had maintained since his mother's time. "It looks perfect," Jackson said, entering the parlor with 2 glasses of spiced cider. He handed one to Emma, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "I found something while organizing the attic last week," Emma said, retrieving a small package from beneath the tree. "I thought you might want it returned to its proper place tonight." Jackson unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a delicate silver star ornament, tarnished with age. His expression softened with recognition. "My mother's tree topper. I thought it was lost years ago during the move to the new house." "It was in a box marked Margaret Miller, personal," Emma explained. "Mrs. Patterson helped me identify it." Without speaking, Jackson lifted the star carefully and placed it atop the tree, completing the decoration that now blended old traditions with new beginnings. As they stood together admiring the finished tree, the distance between them seemed to diminish, not through dramatic declaration or sudden passion, but through the quiet accumulation of shared moments, mutual support, and growing understanding. "Merry Christmas, Emma," Jackson said softly, his hand finding hers in the firelit room. "Merry Christmas, Jackson," she replied, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture as simple and profound as the partnership they had built from the most practical of beginnings. Outside, snow continued to fall across Evergreen Ranch, covering the land in pristine white, while inside Aspen Lodge, 2 people who had once been strangers found warmth in a connection neither had expected.